sanctions are weapons of economic war. When a government or a person or a company or a group or whomever is the target of U.S. sanctions, they're generally prevented from entering the United States, and businesses, all businesses around the world with any connection at all to the financial system based in the United States, are prohibited from working with those people or groups or governments. So banks can't give them their own money or process their financial transactions. Companies can't sell them products. They basically become non-persons as far as the US-based financial system is concerned when they are inflicted with sanctions. On top of that, any businesses that are caught providing products or services to someone on the sanctions list can end up on the sanctions list themselves. And you might be wondering, who the fuck do we think we are to just make up a list, put anyone we want on it, and then tell foreign individuals and companies that they must obey our lists or else? Well, you would not be alone in those thoughts. Sanctions piss off other countries all the time, including our allies. And other countries in this world are creating systems together now to get around our sanctions. And our sanctions, more and more lately, they're failing.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. If you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the 235th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is your first time listening to Congressional Dish, this is a podcast that I started in 2012 because I was being super weird and watching raw footage of Congress and discovered that there was fascinating stuff happening in there that wasn't being covered by the mainstream news or the blogs or really anyone. And that was making me insane. And so I started a podcast before many people even knew what podcasts were to share what I was finding with whoever might find the show and care. And almost 9 years later, it turns out that many thousands of people care, and this is now my full-time job. But the original problem that made me nuts still remains, which is that we are being failed by the corporate press, who choose stories that will be safe for their advertisers. Advertisers that include banks and multinational companies and politicians who funnel these companies literally billions of dollars for campaign ads. Whether the journalists, if you can even call them that, in corporate media are corrupt overtly, or whether it's self-censorship to avoid biting the corporate hands that feed them through ads, there are things going on in this world that we don't understand because they aren't telling us. And by watching Congress, by virtually sitting in on their hearings and reading their bills and laws, we can learn so much about what's happening in this world and how this world really works. And so Congressional Dish is my attempt to add some of that information to the greater conversation. And today I'm going to attempt to add more awareness to the conversation about sanctions, which is a word that a lot of Americans simply don't understand, despite the fact that we're inflicting sanctions upon so many people around the world. Sanctions are weapons in economic wars. And so by the end of this episode, you're going to understand them better than you do now. Or at least I hope so, because I know that this research has helped me understand the big picture. A big picture that the shareholder class doesn't want us to see. I think the information that I'm going to share here could be a major scandal if presented to the world on a mainstream corporate news scale. But like I said, they get paid by the multinational companies that don't want us understanding what sanctions are and precisely why the sanctions aren't working as intended. Telling this story would mean biting the hands full of money that enable the cable news personalities the ability to afford their yachts. But I'm going to tell you this stuff today because I'm not fed by those hands. If the multinational bankers get mad at me, I don't fucking care because this show is crowdfunded. And that business model is key. This show is good because of the freedom I have to tell you the truth as I see it, regardless of what powerful pricks it pisses off. There is no sponsor too big to lose. But this will only work if you participate in this value for value funding model. And last month was the worst month we've had since before the election. And I think that's my fault because with everything that's been going on in my personal life, I skipped this part of the episodes for a few months. I just kind of had to stop paying attention to money while I was hemorrhaging it in order to not lose my mind. But my financials just slapped me across the face. And so I do need to tell you up top today that I need you to support this show. This podcast operates on the value for value business model invented by Adam Curry and John C. Dvorak. And the way this works is that I make as valuable a podcast as I possibly can for you. And in return, you pay whatever amount represents the value you feel you receive. All of the payment options are listed in every episode's show notes, which are also an important part of this podcast because I don't expect you to take my word for anything that I say, because sometimes I'm wrong and I'll always admit it when the mistake is caught. And actually, now that I say that, in the last thank you episode, I word vomited that ivermectin is an antiviral drug. And it's not, or at least we don't think so, maybe, but that's the hope. People hope that it's an antiviral drug, but for now, we know that it's an anti-parasite drug. So my apologies for leading you astray. But see, I don't know shit about some things, and I'll admit mistakes. But the vast majority of the stuff I discover in my research is true and provable. It's just fascinating and hard to believe sometimes. And so I give you all my sources in every episode's show notes. Every article, every document, every hearing, with timestamps and transcripts of the sound clips so that you can easily find them and listen to them in context. I believe that trust is earned, and so I show you my work so you can check it and judge it for yourself. And I also know, because I use them myself for this purpose, that there is nothing more satisfying than getting into a political debate, being called a bullshitter, and then being able to pull up the actual law or document or mainstream news bulletin proving that what you say is true. You know, being able to tell that uncle at Thanksgiving that you can prove that he's in fact the bullshitter. Oh, it feels so good. And so I want to make that easy for you to experience too. And so many producers have told me that they've used my show notes for exactly that purpose. And I am so here for it. I love that you guys are getting satisfaction from the show notes that way, just like I do. And so if you support this show continuing to exist with proof of my claims without corporate overlords, please send physical checks to our Florida address or sign up to pay per episode on Patreon or pay monthly on PayPal or whenever you feel like it on PayPal or Zelle or Venmo or Cash App or Pop Money. And I also have cryptocurrency addresses, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Litecoin right now. But whatever works for you in whatever amount you think represents the value you receive, that works for me. The only number that doesn't work for me is 0. And if you do that, you'll not only be incentivizing me to keep doing this job, to stay on this hamster wheel of never-ending research, but you'll also join the ranks of producers who get thanked and can have brief messages read on the thank you episodes. You'll also get access to my green room, which is my private feed that has all of these public episodes with no profanity censors. So if you don't like that golf swing sound effect that you just heard, you can get rid of it by paying me. There's also bonus episodes back there with personal updates, some conversations with friends, coworkers, and other podcasters, and some Mystery Science Theater 3000 type episodes where I watch hearings for my research and record all of my snark and bullshit along the way. Now, the easiest way to access that is Patreon, but I do have a way to get it to you no matter how you pay. So just email my sister, Lauren@congressionaldish.com, along with your payment. We can get you set up with that. But that's how things work here. And June was a brutal month, so please support this show, especially if you're someone who hasn't yet. And thank you to all the producers who already are supporting the show. I think you know how much I love you. Okay, so let's get started with this episode. And I want to get it started with a quick refresher on the big picture as I've grown to see it after 9 years of producing this show. If this is your first episode, and this summary doesn't make sense to you, I get it. And I have a list of previous Congressional Dish episodes for you in this episode's show notes that will fill you in nicely, especially episode 102 about the World Trade Organization. So start with that one and then go through the list in order, and you'll be pretty well caught up and ready for this episode. But basically, as I understand it, based on a lot of research, our foreign policy here in the United States since at least the end of World War II has centered around getting the entire world to obey rules written and enforced by what I have nicknamed the World Trade System. Other nicknames for this system are the West and capitalism, and they've certainly hijacked the word democracy. But those are entirely too broad for my tastes because the players in this system can be named and can be changed. And so I think identifying them clearly is the first step to understanding what's going on. And this system, economic system, I should say, is centered around the World Trade Organization, which is why I refer to the system as the World Trade System. The World Trade Organization was intended to be created right after World War II, but they actually didn't get it done until the end of 1994, so that's not all that long ago. And the other main pieces of the World Trade System, which were created right after World War II, are the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But the goal of the people devoted to the cause, which I should tell you includes the vast majority of the members of both of our two main political parties, well, their goal is to get the entire world to follow the rules dictated by the World Trade Organization. It is meant to be the global financial system with no competition. The rules that are written in the World Trade Organization are the international norms that everyone is meant to follow. And there are countless other organizations that function to expand and solidify this system. But instead of being honest about what they're trying to do and naming it correctly, they constantly say that they are acting to expand and defend democracy, which is extremely annoying. But if in your head you replace democracy with World Trade System every time you hear them say it, the global game makes a lot more sense. Because we have a long history of overthrowing actual democracies, where the voters have chosen presidents that don't want to design their economic laws to match the World Trade System, but instead to choose to do it another way. And I'm not going to go down that list now. Longtime Congressional Dish listeners and many, many millions of people around the world are already very familiar with our regime change efforts and the democracies that we've overthrown. But in those efforts, there is a familiar pattern. First come the sanctions, and if those don't work, then comes the war. Now, war is easy enough to understand. It's what we did in Iraq. But sanctions, I know I didn't fully understand them, outside of the big picture concept. Because what's pretty obvious about them and easy to understand is that sanctions are weapons of economic war. When a government or a person or a company or a group or whomever is the target of U.S. sanctions, they're generally prevented from entering the United States, and businesses, all businesses around the world with any connection at all to the financial system based in the United States, are prohibited from working with those people or groups or governments. So banks can't give them their own money or process their financial transactions. Companies can't sell them products. They basically become non-persons as far as the U.S.-based financial system is concerned when they are inflicted with sanctions. On top of that, any businesses that are caught providing products or services to someone on the sanctions list can end up on the sanctions list themselves. Now, sanctions are sometimes ordered by Congress. So, for example, in episode 156 of Congressional Dish, I told you about a law that passed 419 to 3 in the House and 98 to 2 in the Senate. Briney and Rand Paul were the two no's. But there was a law that was passed by the overwhelming majorities in both corporate parties that forced President Trump to inflict sanctions upon people inside and doing business with people in North Korea, Iran, and Russia. And I have that episode in the show notes for you. But the president also has the power to enact sanctions on his own, using emergency powers, because most economic sanctions are based on national emergency authorities. And so, to enact sanctions on his own, first the president declares that a national emergency exists. Then he has to tell Congress about the emergency and publish that notice in the Federal Register. And that's it. Congress has totally delegated the power to declare emergencies to the president, leaving the people's branch of government with no role of approval or disapproval. But it wasn't always this way. The powers the president uses now to declare emergencies and use sanctions to wage economic war were granted by the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which became law in 1977, which is the bastard child of the Trading with the Enemy Act, a law enacted in 1917 that was designed to grant the president power to determine who we could swap supplies with during World War I. Basically, the Trading with the Enemy Act gave the president a lot of control over international economic transactions during times of war, essentially eliminating freedom from the international market during any time that we have official enemies. But even back then, the definition of enemies was super broad, including individuals and corporations of any nationality. But when the war ended in 1921, Congress repealed a lot of the war powers granted to the president, but not the Trading with the Enemy Act. That one stayed on the books. In fact, in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, Congress expanded the Trading with the Enemy Act to delegate the power to declare emergencies to the president during peacetime, too, and gave him many more powers over both international and domestic financial transactions. Now, this was marketed to the public as necessary and good by speaking about the Depression as if it were a war, a trick we should be all too familiar with here in modern times. The drug war, the war on poverty, fighting homelessness. Well, during the Depression, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt asked Congress for, quote, broad economic power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe, unquote. And the dumb motherfuckers in the 1930s Congress actually fell for that and gave him the powers. And presidents have been expanding and I think abusing those powers ever since. Because it was the 1930s powers, which included the power for the president to declare national emergencies to grant himself economic war powers. Those powers are what formed the basis for waging all the economic wars during the Cold War years. The Cold War, which was not an actual war, but instead a battle of economic systems. The World Trade System versus basically all the other systems in the world, which were all branded as communism, whether they actually fit the textbook definition of communism or not. Basically, communism equaled the bad guys, and sanctions were the weapons used in those economic wars, until it became clear that they weren't working, and in those instances, then the CIA or our actual military moved in to hand the governments to the World Trade System adopters by force. In the 1970s, though, after the U.S. military's clusterfuck fighting communism in Vietnam, it became clear that the national emergency powers were being abused because us taxpayers realized that our country had been under a constant state of emergency for over 40 years. And so in response, that Congress passed the National Emergencies Act, which ended all of the national emergencies in 1978, and they passed the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which was marketed as a law that put limits on the president's emergency power. Those limits were essentially adding reporting requirements and the requirements that the emergencies be renewed every year. But as we have documented on this very show, those measures are just a formality. The president routinely renews emergencies by submitting a letter to Congress, and hardly anyone notices or cares. And so we've been under a state of emergency since President Jimmy Carter declared an emergency just the following year, right after they canceled all the emergencies 1 year later. We had an emergency when the government that our CIA had installed in Iran was overthrown in 1979, which means we have now been under a constant state of emergency for 42 years and counting. And in case you're wondering, yes, Congress does have the power to end a national emergency, but they've just never actually used that power. Not once. And the result is that right now, according to a list being maintained on Wikipedia, because I couldn't find an official one, but that list on Wikipedia says that we are currently under 35 national emergencies, and 30 of them are emergencies that allow the president to use sanctions. Out of the 30 current sanctions justifying national emergencies we're currently suffering, 2 have been declared by our new President Biden against people in Burma and Russia. 4 were declared by President Trump. 10 were declared by President Obama. 10 were declared by President George W. Bush. 4 were declared by President Clinton. And then, of course, there's the one I just mentioned that was declared in 1979 by President Carter. And over the years, not only have the number of never-ending national emergencies steadily increased, but so have the targets and types of sanctions those emergencies have authorized, with presidents granting themselves more and more economic war waging powers with damn near no pushback from any of the recent Congresses. So in the beginning, when sanctions were first authorized in World War I, sanctions targeted other governments, and we still have those. So as of January 2021, we have sanctions in place against Russia, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, Libya, Cuba, Yemen, Belarus, Lebanon, Burundi, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Nicaragua, Somalia, South Sudan, Eritrea and Guinea-Bissau. And no, I have no idea where those last two countries even are. But during my lifetime, the emergency declarations have been broadened to the point that our government can declare and enact economic war against, well, just about anyone. Because we've sanctioned random groups, we've sanctioned political parties, corporations, individual people, and Donald Trump even sanctioned people just for being associated with the International Criminal Court because they dared to try to investigate our war crimes in Afghanistan. Basically, the authorities granted and taken with no pushback by the presidents are constantly growing, with Donald Trump, surprise, surprise, being the president to take granting himself broad powers to a whole new level. When at the end of 2017, he declared an emergency because, quote, human rights abuses and corruption around the world constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States, unquote. And he authorized sanctions against, amongst others, anyone, quote, directly or indirectly engaged in corruption, including the misappropriation of state assets, the expropriation of private assets for personal gain, corruption related to government contracts or the extraction of natural resources, or bribery or the transfer or the facilitation of the transfer of the proceeds of corruption, unquote. Which is a classification that can be twisted to target damn near anyone in any part of the world. And by the way, President Biden has not canceled this crazy Trump executive order. And I've got to tell you, my mind is literally swirling right now with the names of current members of Congress who fit this definition perfectly and could legally be sanctioned based on this executive order. Or national emergency, I should call it. All of the people that we know of in Congress that are still there who have made money on the stock market using their congressional knowledge, Nancy Pelosi, Richard Burr, Tom Malinowski. We also have people who have used their positions of power to funnel government contracts to their husbands, Dianne Feinstein. And bribery, my God, the whole campaign donation system is just legalized bribery and every one of us knows it. In fact, Trump's executive order also allows sanctions to be targeted at, quote, the making of any contribution or provision of funds, goods, or services by, to, or for the benefit of any person whose property and interest in property are blocked, unquote, which would make campaign donations to our own politicians sanctionable offenses as well, if Congress were ever subject to the laws they write for the rest of us peasants. But that's how broad the existing authorities enacted by Donald Trump are for sanctioning people. But of course, Trump couldn't have done that without authorities granted to him by Congress. In the middle of the Obama years, Congress passed and Obama signed the Global Magnitsky Act, which took sanctions authorities that were originally authorized in 2012 to target only Russians involved with the arrest, torture, and death of a Russian lawyer, and then essentially made those authorities global and applicable to whoever the president wants to target, by saying that person is, quote, responsible for significant acts of corruption, unquote, a power that Donald Trump then chose to put into action. But big picture, the goal of all sanctions is always this. Here's Dr. Jeffrey Taliaferro. He is a professor of political science at Tufts University, and here he is testifying to the House Financial Services Committee on June 16th.
The primary aim of sanctions, whether unilateral or multilateral, whether comprehensive or targeted, is to induce a change in the cost-benefit calculations of the target, and thus a change in the target's behavior.
But there are different kinds of sanctions based on what kind of behavior we want changed. So first, there's comprehensive jurisdictional sanctions, often referred to as embargoes. This type of sanction generally prohibits people and companies from doing business with whole countries or territories, and these are the most regime-changey. So these are the kind that we currently are using against Iran, Cuba, Syria, North Korea, and Venezuela. And so, for example, in Venezuela, we have sanctioned their oil industry, which is controlled by the Venezuelan government, and all companies that do business with their oil industry and their central bank, essentially cutting off the entire government from the world trade system, or at least attempting to do so. In a few minutes, you're going to hear testimony about how countries like Venezuela are getting around our sanctions, and their methods are probably not what you think. But these sanctions are the most extreme, and they're designed to starve a government or population of money and comfort so that they will regime change themselves. There's also conduct and list-based sanctions. Now, list-based sanctions focus on individuals, companies, and groups accused of criminal activity like terrorism or selling weapons, drug trafficking, corruption, cyber hacking, like bad guy things. These people and groups are added to the specially designated nationals and blocked persons, the SDN list at the Department of the Treasury. And then banks use that list to essentially steal and hold anything these people have in their banks. It's a freezing of their assets. These are the types of sanctions that turn people into non-persons, people who can't have bank accounts or credit cards or passports or a business in the world trade system as long as they remain on the list. And these are the types of sanctions that are often used to target government officials and people associated with them and just, random humans, but not the entire population of a government. And Donald Trump, that vindictive prick, he loved these kinds of sanctions, adding more than 1,000 names to the list every year that he was in office, which is more than two-term President George W. Bush added during his entire presidency and almost as many as two-term President Obama. But I found out that we can actually download the sanctions list anytime we want to from the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control's website. Now, that department, that part of Treasury, is known as OFAC, and you'll hear that referenced a lot today. But OFAC is essentially our country's sanctions police. But I found the list on OFAC's website of all of the sanctioned people and groups, and I downloaded it. And of course, I put it in the show notes for you. But I wasn't able to really comb through it and find any juicy stories for you because it's 1,564 pages long. It was not a short list. But here's a member of Congress with information about what I would have found had I had an extra few months to study the SDN list. Here's Representative Warren Davidson of Ohio in the House Financial Services Committee on June 16th.
Currently, the SDN list statistics as of yesterday, the 15th, we have 277 aircraft, 3,668 entities, 4,603 individuals, and 406 vessels.
It's a long list. And man, do I wish I had a team of minions to dig through it and find the stories behind all the people and companies and things that are on it. But I don't have a team of well-paid research minions because I don't take corporate money. I don't have CNN levels of cash. And the money they waste on holograms and debates among assholes. But yeah, I don't have those resources. And so let's just move on to the next kind of sanctions, which are sectoral sanctions. And these kinds are relatively new. These were first used by the Obama-Biden administration after Joe Biden and friends midwifed a coup in Ukraine.
I was, but it just happened to be that was the assignment I got. I got all the good ones. So I got Ukraine.
And what he did in Ukraine was help to replace the president of Ukraine, who had just agreed to partner economically with Russia, with another president who would instead partner with the European Union and World Trade System. After that coup, the day after, Russia took over a peninsula hanging off the coast of Ukraine called Crimea, a peninsula that housed a major Russian military base. And Obama-Biden invented sectoral sanctions to punish people and businesses in Crimea, and people and businesses that have somehow helped Russia maintain control of Crimea. These sanctions were invented because punishing all of Russia with the types of sanctions we have in place and clearly have aimed towards regime change in Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Syria, and Cuba, well, those were considered to be too escalatory. And so they thought that doing that to Russia would have too many negative consequences, like maybe a World War III against a country with enough nuclear weapons to actually fight back against us effectively. And so these sectoral sanctions are like middle-of-the-road sanctions, not targeting the whole country, but more than just targeting individuals. And then finally, the last kind of sanctions are secondary sanctions, which basically apply punishments to foreign people and companies who choose to do business with those that we've put on our sanctions list. So like a foreign oil company that buys Iranian or Venezuelan oil, or foreign banks that hold money for and process transactions for anyone on our lists. And you might be wondering, who the fuck do we think we are to just make up a list, put anyone we want on it, and then tell foreign individuals and companies that they must obey our lists or else? Well, you would not be alone in those thoughts. These secondary sanctions piss off other countries all the time, including our allies. And other countries in this world are creating systems together now to get around our sanctions. And ever since President Donald Trump ripped up the Iran nuclear deal, which we had negotiated not only with our allies, but also with China and Russia. The Iran nuclear deal was a big deal in the world with the cast of characters who had come together to agree to it. Well, Donald Trump, as our representative in this world, had us go back on our word. We're the bad guys in that story. We're the bad faith actors. And even our allies have been helping Iran get around our sanctions ever since in a desperate attempt to keep them in compliance despite us going back on our world. And so to tie all that together here and to explain to us the big picture as he explained it to the House Financial Services Committee, here's Professor Taliaferro of Tufts University again.
Having won the Cold War and pushed the crumbling Soviet Union out of the ranks of the great powers, the United States emerged as the unipole, the only great power left standing in 1990-1991. And for better or worse, for 2 decades, weak systemic, that is international constraints, and the availability of opportunities to further improve its strategic position afforded the United States wide latitude in the definition and in the pursuit of its foreign policy and national security objectives. This extreme imbalance of international power, however, had several consequences which are relevant to the subject of today's subcommittee hearing. First, the United States imposed sanctions and even waged wars against recalcitrant states such as Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan, and non-state actors such as Al-Qaeda and later the Islamic State with relative impunity. And even when confronting state adversaries against whom the use of kinetic force would have been prohibitively costly, such as North Korea and Iran, the imposition of sanctions became a preferred tool of statecraft for successive administrations and Congresses. Second, U.S. military command of the commons, along with American economic and technological dominance, gave various state and non-state actors an incentive to pursue asymmetric strategies. For example, the clandestine employment of cyber criminal organizations and individual hackers by the foreign intelligence services of Russia, China, North Korea, and other states. Third, this unipolar distribution of power gave targeted states and other disadvantaged actors an incentive to collaborate with one another to evade or subvert U.S. sanctions. And finally, as the Biden administration's interim national security strategic guidance acknowledges, the distribution of power across the world is changing, creating new threats.
And here's what he told Congress we can expect in the future in terms of the effectiveness of our economic wars, our sanctions.
Might behoove policymakers to perhaps lower their expectations about what coercive economic diplomacy alone can achieve.
And here's why that matters. Here's why we need to care. Here's Representative Jim Himes of Connecticut, a shameless servant of the bankers, who is now the chairman of the House Committee on Financial Services. And this is part of his opening statement in the hearing he called on June 16th to examine how people, companies, and countries are getting around our sanctions.
Sanctions are an important instrument in foreign policy designed to be both a carrot and a stick in persuading an entity, an individual, a group, or a country to change its behavior. A step beyond traditional diplomacy, it also avoids the downsides of kinetic action. We've seen the success of our sanctions regimes in bringing the Iranians to the table and isolating human rights violators through the Global Magnitsky Act, amongst others. Our sanctions programs can only be as impactful as they are effective. When designated entities evade our sanctions, we lose an important tool from our diplomatic toolbox, increasing the likelihood that military action would be necessary to maintain international order.
When sanctions fail, that's how we end up in wars to expand and enforce the international order, otherwise known as the rules of the World Trade System. And our sanctions, more and more lately, they're failing. This podcast has documented the epic failure that the Trump administration experienced in their attempt to overthrow the government of Venezuela, using the harshest of sanctions to try to force President Maduro's regime to hand power to a DC stooge named Juan Guaido. In Iran, we've been in a state of emergency for 42 years, and their government still stands. Then there's Cuba. That little island off the coast of Florida has resisted our shit since the Cold War. And in North Korea, the Un family still reigns supreme. Because despite all of our sanctions, This is the reality. Here's Lakshmi Kumar. She's a former World Bank consultant who is now the policy director at Global Financial Integrity, which is a think tank dedicated to tracking and providing suggestions to stop global money flows outside the World Trade System. This is her testimony on June 16th.
Despite the ever-increasing reach of sanctions, with evidence showing that the number of sanctioned vessels and ports grows with an annual rate of 6%, oil exports by Iran and Venezuela and oil imports by North Korea keep increasing every year.
So not only are our sanctions not crippling these countries, they are thriving and growing their exports despite us. Now, one of the reasons for this is that many of the targets of our sanctions are foreign people, companies, groups, and countries that don't have significant connections to our markets or financial system. They have other options now. So, for example, in order for the sanctions to matter to many of these people, they would have to have money or property in the United States or in our banks, or be doing business with our citizens or our companies in this system. But if they never got involved with our systems to begin with, there's not much we can take away to hurt them. And this is one of the reasons why the world traders consider the other system that China is in charge of creating to be such an existential threat. And if you want to know about the Chinese situation in detail, I have a few episodes for you in this episode show notes. But the Pacific Deterrence Initiative episode was only 5 episodes ago, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that again here. But here's Eric Lorber. During the Obama years, this guy was a lawyer at OFAC, so he was a lawyer for the sanctions police. And then he took a spin through the revolving door into the corporate world, working for 2 years helping multinational corporations understand and comply with sanctions. In the late Obama years, he moved over to the Center for a New American Security, which is one of the creepiest of organizations made up of elites trying to get the entire world to economically integrate into the World Trade System, where he left to then go to the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which, just that name, knowing that the word democracy has been hijacked by these douchebags as a stand-in for World Trade System captured countries, Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Oh boy. Well, this guy went from that organization to our government, working for the Trump administration as the senior advisor to the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the Department of the Treasury, where he made decisions about our sanctions for the Trump administration. And now he's back at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, again as their senior director on economic and financial power. He's also the managing director at K2 Integrity, which touts itself as, quote, built by industry leaders, unquote, to help multinationals deal with international regulations. Now, of course, almost none of this background, except for his Trump administration work in the government, was highlighted in the hearing. But this guy is the walking definition of the revolving door and is 100% on board with the World Trade System going full global. And here's how he answered a question posed about North Korea, which is also known as the TPRK. And he also mentions the UN, which stands for United Nations, which is where the world is supposed to meet to solve all our differences with words instead of wars. But it's located in New York City, and it's always seemed pretty World Trade System captured to me. But that's opinion. The United Nations is known as the UN. But anyway, here's Eric Lorber.
There needs to be political pressure put on those who are supporting and continue to support North Korea. It's not a secret that, for example, China has created at least a permissive environment for North Korean operatives to work in the country. That was detailed most recently, I believe, in the UN DPRK panel of experts report from, I believe it was March 2021. As well as North Korea maintains a series of financial facilitators throughout the world, including in, I believe, in Russia and China and other jurisdictions that help North Korea evade U.S. and UN sanctions. And these individuals need to be shut down, need to be targeted, and pressure needs to be put on the governments that are hosting them to kick them out of the country.
So China and Russia, by creating a system outside of the World Trade System and not cooperating with the crackdowns that we would like on the people that are helping sanctions evaders, well, they're making it easier for the countries, people, and companies that we sanction to continue to function. And so the existence of their alternative system is therefore reducing the World Trade System's power to use money, or the cutting off of money, to force people, companies, and countries to assimilate or die. And China is in the process of taking that a step further. In January of 2021, just a few months ago, China's Ministry of Commerce unveiled counter-sanctions, which would prohibit Chinese citizens and companies from complying with, quote, unjustified, unquote, foreign trade restrictions, which I think we can safely assume to mean our sanctions, which could soon force multinational companies to have to choose between complying with the United States or Chinese regulations. In essence, the stage is being set for a situation where companies might soon have to choose between the World Trade System and the Chinese system, where right now they can kind of exist in both. And when you look at that possibility, there's a lot of money to be made in China's Belt and Road Initiative. You know, here in the United States, we can't even keep our own bridges and buildings standing, forget building amazing infrastructure projects all over the world. For companies and shareholders that care only about profit, siding with us, that's not the automatic best bet anymore. But anyway, so that's one situation, China, Russia, helping sanctions evaders with their separate system. But another way that people, companies, and countries are getting around sanctions is the way that I think a lot of us are assuming that they are, via cryptocurrencies. In fact, all of the messages that I've gotten about sanctions since I told you guys in the thank you episode that I was working on a sanctions episode have mentioned cryptocurrencies. And for good reason. I mean, they definitely are used. So here's Jesse Spiro. He is the, and every time I see that, I do see Jesse Spano, but his name is Jesse Spiro. And he's a former volunteer at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. I mean, it's just amazing how all these fuckers know each other. But he's now the Chief Government Affairs Officer, aka lobbyist, for a company called Chainalysis, which is a company dedicated to providing cryptocurrency services, so data, software, research, and investigative help, to governments, cybersecurity companies, banks, and insurance companies all over the world. And here's what that crypto lobbyist dude told Congress on June 16th.
Through blockchain analysis, we can confirm that adversarial nations, terrorist organizations, malicious-enabled cyber actors, and transnational criminal organizations under U.S. sanctions have used cryptocurrency in an attempt to weaken the impact or fully circumvent sanctions, just as they have done through traditional banks, trade-based money laundering, and cash.
But here's Eric Lorber. He's the walking revolving door exhibit currently working at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies.
The number of transactions which are illicit that use Bitcoin or blockchain technology is actually fairly low percentage-wise. It's, I believe, below 1% or somewhere around there. So it's fairly small.
And I learned some reasons for why that is. And as someone who's been kind of forced into learning how cryptocurrencies work by my lovely producers who insisted upon paying me in cryptocurrencies, these explanations actually make perfect sense to me. So first up, here's Representative Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts, bringing up the myth that cryptocurrency transactions are fully anonymous, which is one of the reasons why so many people think that they're great for doing illegal things. And for those of you not hip to the lingo, like me, because I definitely had to look this up, KYC means know your customer. But here's Representative Auchincloss talking to Jesse Spiro, not Spano.
Would blockchain offer you an advantage in obfuscating your identity over a different type of currency?
No, I would actually posit the complete opposite, Congressman. You know, what I would say is that the only vulnerabilities that I would address in relation to KYC are the fact that people could circumvent them. But even if they were to, if they're engaged in illicit activity that can be seen in relation to illicit crypto activity, it is going to be very difficult for them to do anything within the ecosystem.
And why is that? Well, here's Daniel Glazer, and this is from a different hearing that took place on February 25th in the same committee. But this guy, Daniel Glazer, is basically like an Eric Lorber clone. He worked for the Treasury Department during the George W. Bush and Obama years, and then he took a spin in the revolving door and now works at K2 Integrity. He also now works at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. But on top of that, right now, he's also serving on the board of the Qatar Financial Center Regulatory Authority, which is a rabbit hole in itself because this is a private organization with a board made up of 4 old white dudes and 3 Qataris that appears to be writing the regulations for international commerce in Qatar. And like I said, rabbit hole. I don't know what the that's all about, but he's one of the 4 old dudes on that board. So make of that what you will. And he also used to be on the board of HSBC's Middle East Financial Risk Advisory Committee, which I find notable because HSBC is the multinational bank that you might remember got busted and had to pay billions in fines for money laundering for Mexican and Colombian drug cartels. And so we know that HSBC was a corporate sanctions evader, and this dude worked for them at a high level, and so he probably knows something about sanctions evasion. And Congress has asked for his advice. You know, you probably didn't need to know all that about him right now for this clip, but I'm always just amazed about who gets to ask to testify and teach our lawmakers about what's up in the world, you know? But anyway, here's why Daniel Glazer said it's hard for cryptocurrencies to be used for sanctions evasion.
I think it's important to remember that if you want to be able to use a cryptocurrency in the real economy to any scale, it at some point does need to be converted into actual fiat currency, into dollars. That's the place where the Treasury Department does regulate cryptocurrencies.
Which is true. Because what can you buy with a Bitcoin? I know of one coffee company in Oakland that accepts Bitcoins. Just one. That's it. And I'm sure others exist, but like I'm kind of out in the world a lot, and that's the only one I've ever seen, which means that the only real way to use them in the real world right now is to swap them for dollars. And that swap point is where you need an exchange, which is where the government can see what's going on. And it's those exchanges. That's how they know if we have to pay taxes on our cryptocurrencies. It's when we sell them in an exchange for actual cash. And so cryptocurrencies are not anonymous if the criminals want to actually use the money. And on top of that, there's the blockchain. Now, I'm going to explain this like a real dum-dum, but basically, every transaction made with cryptocurrency is recorded in a way that anyone can look at it. It's all public on the magic blockchain. Now, the names aren't listed on there, and I wouldn't know how to use it to find anything, but other people do. And any cryptocurrency that goes into, let's say, Mr. Bad Guy's wallet, well, we can see which wallets that money got transferred from and to. Like, you can see all the connections to that wallet. It's all public. And that visibility means that if the government can figure out who owns any of the wallets involved, they have a clue to start investigations with. Follow the wallets, and you'll eventually find some names. And so here's more of that conversation between Representative Auchincloss and Jesse Spiro, the cryptocurrency lobbyist guy.
If you were able to advise Congress to take any steps that would influence OFAC's measures, what would you advise that we do?
I would just advise to apply, Congressman, more resources to that agency, specifically in relation to the risks associated with cryptocurrency and sanctions evasion, wherein they can produce more designations that include cryptocurrency wallets. Because as identifiers for the private sector, when they have access to that information, that is how they can potentially mitigate the illicit activity. And because of the activity with cryptocurrency, when a wallet is put on that designation list, any associated activity, or within a designation, any associated activity and legacy activity in relation to that look back can also be
visible. Yeah.
And so for all these reasons, cryptocurrencies are not ideal for sanctions evasion and are not even close to the primary way that people, companies, and countries are getting around sanctions. But regardless of that, Daniel Glazer, the K2 integrity, defending democracy, regulating Qatar somehow, and working for money laundering banks guy, well, he gave this testimony that indicates that more regulations of crypto may be coming.
Cryptocurrency exchanges are regarded as money service businesses. They have full customer due diligence requirements. They have full money laundering program requirements. They have reporting requirements. The U.S. Treasury Department just last month issued a proposed rule relating to unhosted wallets of cryptocurrencies, and that's out for notice for notice and comment right now. It addresses the particular issue of wallets that are not hosted on a particular exchange, and I think it's an important rule that's out there, and I do encourage people to take a look at it. The comment period closes in May, and then hopefully Treasury will be able to take regulatory action to close that particular vulnerability.
Now, that testimony was back in February, and obviously I'm recording this in July, so May has passed. And so we've missed our opportunity to comment on whatever they're proposing. And this is a rabbit hole that I don't have the time or the knowledge base to jump down fully right now. But what I did find out is that Treasury is working on rules that would require banks and other money service businesses like Coinbase to keep records of and submit reports to the government when we transfer more than $3,000 in crypto funds to our own private wallets. And they specifically cited their concerns about crypto being used to evade sanctions as one of the reasons, even though experts are telling our lawmakers that crypto is a minor player in the sanctions evasions game. And so I'm going to leave that here for now, but I know that we have a bunch of crypto nerd producers. And so if anyone wants to check that out and share your knowledge about what you know about this, that's what the thank you episodes are for. Let me know with your donations. But I have to move on from this right now, even though I'm sure we're going to have concerns, because this is an episode about sanctions. And again, cryptocurrency is not the reason they're being evaded. But I promise I'm keeping an eye on this crypto stuff. But again, I can't emphasize this enough. Cryptocurrencies are not even close to the main way that people, companies, and governments are evading sanctions. And so, how are they doing it? Well, here's Lakshmi Kumar, who's the World Bank consultant turned think taker, providing advice on how to stop money from flowing outside the world trade system. Here's what she told our Congress just a couple weeks ago.
It is unsurprising that a leading mechanism to evade sanctions involves the use of TVML techniques. TVML, or trade-based money laundering, is the process of disguising the proceeds of crime and moving value through trade transactions. It includes techniques like falsifying the origins of a commodity or good, over-invoicing, under-invoicing, and phantom invoicing where no goods really move, but just money moves.
Oh, they're using our financial system and just cooking their books? You don't say.
TVML is particularly challenging because there are no international standards, even at the level of the Financial Task Force, and little regulation internationally. It is therefore the perfect ally for sanctions evaders.
Oh, having essentially no policing of our financial system has negative consequences? Who would have thought?
The Iranian government was able to pocket $100 billion by falsifying trade records.
That's amazing.
Similarly, the Venezuelan government, to get around US sanctions on its gold sector, has flown its gold all over the world, changing its origins. So the gold is now supposedly from the Caribbean, from Colombia, from Uganda, from Dubai, really anywhere but Venezuela.
Oh, Venezuela's selling gold all over the world just by lying about its origin? Everywhere in the world?
Erasing its history in this way means that the US has no way of knowing whether the gold it imports is the same gold that it is seeking to sanction. Sanction entities continue to look at the US as a safe haven to get around sanctions.
We're the safe haven. Isn't that just perfect? And now that I think about it, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've already mentioned the multinational bank HSBC and their whole money laundering situation. But ING, Barclays, Credit Suisse, these World Trade System banks, they've already gotten caught helping Iran and Libya, Sudan, Burma get around our sanctions. And if you think about it, cost-benefit analysis, if the fines and likelihood of getting caught in a financial system that's been deregulated, if the fines in that system are less than the commissions and the kickbacks and other bags of cash that they get for helping people, companies, and governments get around our ever-expanding, ridiculously long sanctions list, of course they're going to do it. How many times and in how many ways do the multinational bankers need to prove to us that they pledge allegiance to no flag? They are loyal only to the shareholder class who don't give a single fuck what the companies do as long as they keep racking up the dollars in their portfolios. So yeah, if you're selling some gold, they'll fucking buy it. Just make sure the paperwork says that they can't get in trouble. It makes perfect sense to me. And I know this from experience, I am the shareholder class, at least on a minor scale. I own stocks, and the only number I check is the total in my account. As long as it's going up, I don't give a single fuck. So I'm not policing these corporations that I make money from, and I don't think you are either. Who's policing them? Fucking no one. That's the entire point. This is just how the stock market casino game is played. So, like, of course, this country is the safe haven. And I just feel stupid for having it not occur to me before. And so now let's listen to some testimony about how exactly the United States is the safe haven for anyone wanting to evade U.S. sanctions. And I did get a little ahead of myself with my little rant about the banks there, but this shit's amazing. So here are the specific groups of Americans that are helping people, companies, and countries get around our own sanctions. Here is Lakshmi Kumar again.
Vehicles like private equity, hedge funds, venture capital funds that are exempt from carrying out customer due diligence obligations are also involved in sanctions evasion schemes. A recent FBI leak showed that London and New York hedge funds proposed using a scheme to sell prohibited items from sanctioned countries to the U.S.
Private equity, hedge funds, venture capital, shareholder class, shareholder class, shareholder class. It's amazing! These selfish, short-sighted rich fucks are willing to diminish the long-term power of the financial system designed to benefit them by sabotaging the economic wars being waged by our government to coerce the whole world into that system if it makes them money in the short term. I mean, if you take a step back from it all and, set aside the fact that we're all stuck in the same financial system that's clearly being created and operated by corrupt, short-sighted greed monsters, if you step back from that, it's all kind of super fun and fascinating to watch. Here are the titans of the shareholder class who bribe their servants away into government, who then use the governmental power that they bought, both economic and military power, to expand the world trade financial system that they have fully rigged to benefit themselves. But then they sabotage that same effort to make that system a global financial monopoly if it'll make them some quick and easy bucks. And the reason it's possible is because private equity, hedge funds, and venture capital, as Ms. Kumar said, those were exempted by the Corporate Transparency Act from carrying out customer due diligence obligations. Because, banks, mutual funds, brokers who operate on our peasant level, they're required to identify their customers and make sure that we aren't on the sanctions list, among other obligations. And even these requirements for banks are relatively new and only went into effect in 2016. But hedge funds, which peasants don't even have access to, those are financial playgrounds accessible only to groups of rich people. And private equity and venture capital groups with ownership structures so complex that it's often tough to figure out who owns them because it's lots of people. Well, there aren't identification rules for those groups of investors. There are no regulations saying, hey, we need to know who you are. And this is what deregulation success looks like. And the result is that whether we like the sanctions policies or not, the result is that these people are undermining our foreign policy. They are sabotaging us in our economic wars. And that seems like a pretty big deal to me. But here in America, our mainstream press, owned by corporations, doesn't tell us about scandals like this. The rich people involved in hedge funds and private equity and venture capital are the ones, after all, that pay the most for all those expensive TV ads. But it's not just them that are sabotaging our economic wars. It turns out that real estate in America, our property, is also being used to help sanctions evaders because real estate is another part of our economy where our lack of regulations have made it super easy to hide who actually owns properties here, specifically commercial properties. Most existing reporting requirements apply only to the types of properties that us peasants are most likely to buy, residential real estate, our homes. But business properties, commercial real estate, well, those have fewer rules, and the rules are not enforced equally in all parts of the country. In this next bit of testimony, Ms. Kumar is going to reference two things that you might not be familiar with, because I wasn't. The first is the EB-5 investor program, which was created to encourage rich foreigners to buy at least $900,000, but usually $1.8 million worth of property or businesses here in the United States. And in return for doing that, we give them and their families permanent residency visas. She's also going to mention geographic targeting orders, which are requirements that real estate title issuing companies identify the actual humans behind shell companies that use all cash to buy real estate in Boston, Chicago, Dallas, Honolulu, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Miami, New York City, San Antonio, San Diego, San Francisco, and Seattle. And here's what she said about how real estate is being used to evade sanctions.
Professionals that have helped Iran and North Korea evade sanctions invested their lucrative commissions in real estate through the EB5 investor program, which invests in commercial real estate and buying real estate in states like Alaska. Both commercial real estate and many of the jurisdictions where these investments take place are not part of the geographic targeting orders for real estate.
And Representative Madeline Dean of Pennsylvania followed up on that testimony. And you'll need to know that FinCEN is the nickname for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is a part of the Treasury Department. They're our National Financial Crimes Police. Here's Representative Dean.
Ms. Kumar, I'd like to start with you. In your testimony, I read with interest how you discussed the role that United States real estate, especially commercial real estate, plays in sanction evasion regimes. You specifically mentioned the Geographic Targeting Order, GTO, issued by FinCEN, which I might note includes 12 metropolitan areas only, to require U.S. title insurance companies to identify natural persons behind shell companies used in all cash purchases of residential real estate. Given the limited metropolitan list covered by GTO and the fact that commercial real estate is not covered, can you speak to both of those problems? Number one, the limited number of metropolitan areas, my own suburban Philadelphia or Philadelphia not among them, and also the fact that it's residential, not commercial. Where does this fall short in terms of our regulating evasion?
And here's her answer.
The sanctions program doesn't just target big actors like Iran, North Korea. The sanctions program also targets sort of individuals involved in drug trafficking. And what we see is a lot of those individuals often to evade sanctions, including sort of former officials of the Venezuelan administration, all move or hide assets and move it into real estate. And the US real estate market is a popular avenue. Now, when we talk about commercial real estate, you're absolutely right in that the sort of often cited example of the Iranians owning that massive skyscraper in New York was a purchase of commercial real estate. It continues to be unrecognized. The EB5 investor program is investments that ultimately go into commercial real estate. Now, a lot of this is particularly complex because commercial real estate involves multiple investors. It is not as simple as a residential purchase by a homeowner. To that end, we have to what is necessary is to sort of rethink how we are going to apply the GTOs. The title insurance agents may not be the most relevant actors. However, to sort of identify gatekeepers that do continue to play a critical role in sort of putting together these transactions, because commercial real estate transactions are always take place through legal structures. They are never in the names of an individual. So identifying actors like lawyers who often play a critical role in this as sort of the pressure point at which you can conduct due diligence to know who is behind these transactions is one way forward. You've also rightly said that it only covers 12 metropolitan areas. And a lot of the evasion schemes that we often see tied to individuals, but also more generally, the use of real estate, you often see an equal split between cases that occur in GTO areas versus cases that occur in non-GTO areas. And I will say that we have a report forthcoming in the next month that shows evidence that when looks at a series of reported cases that actually shows that over the last 5 years, the number of cases that occur in non-GTO areas are actually slightly significantly more than GTO areas.
So basically, we have gaping holes in our regulations on commercial real estate so large that the Iranians were able to squeeze a skyscraper through them. But even the weak regulations that we do have, enforcement is a problem.
Finally, sanctions evasion does not just exploit the gaps in regulation. It exploits the lack of resources that enforcement agencies need to detect. The FinCEN files, while problematic, revealed 2 different sanctions evasion schemes tied to Russia and Syria that were filed as SARs by financial institutions, but did not necessarily receive the treatment they should have given the resource constraints of the agency. The way forward, therefore, is 2-pronged, addressing regulatory gaps, but also providing the requisite support to enforcement, supervision, and oversight agencies.
So she's recommending that we refund the Financial Crimes Police. which you would think maybe had occurred to Congress after the banksters crashed the global economy in 2008, but apparently not. But here's Eric Lorber one more time. He's the revolving door dude who has spun between working at our Treasury Department and private World Trade System advancement centers like the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. And here's what he suggested Congress do about these problems.
Key to countering sanctions evasion is the ability to detect such activity. The Treasury Department's Office of Intelligence and Analysis, along with other members of the intelligence community, as well as FinCEN, should be provided with the tools necessary to identify sanctions evasion. A legislative proposal under consideration by this committee, the OFAC Fusion Center Act, could help achieve this. This legislation would create an interagency group designed to share data and allow for better detection and disruption of illicit networks, providing the private sector with the right tools. In recent years, Treasury has armed the private sector with information on sanctions evasion tactics and red flags that can help companies spot such evasion through a series of advisories, combined with clearly signaling to the private sector their compliance obligations and pursuing aggressive enforcement actions against those who fail to comply. This additional information can help the private sector more effectively counter evasion.
So, put another way, there is a proposal floating around in our Congress that is essentially an outsourcing of financial crimes police work to the financial industry, with the whole backstop on this being punishing the banks when they don't do a good job. But the financial industry crashed the global economy, and the banks only got bigger and more powerful. And so if they didn't get punished for that, do we really think handing them more policing power under threat of punishment for not using it is the solution here? But bigger picture, I think the question that we really need to grapple with as a country is, do we really think that having thousands of people, companies, and whole governments on a do not do business with list that is created under emergency conditions, do we really think that all of that sanctions in general, are a good idea? Because one, as we heard, they're not really working. And two, conversations like this one are now being had in our lawmakers' chambers. Here's servant to the bankers, chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, Representative Jim Himes of Connecticut, talking to revolving door user, former Treasury Department official, and current defender of democracy or whatever, Daniel Glazer.
Mr. Glazer, you though suggested something new that I'd like to give you maybe 30 seconds, the 42 seconds I have left to elaborate on. You said you were hopeful for sanctions-like authorities against domestic actors. You did nod to constitutional and civil liberties concerns, but give us another 30 seconds on exactly what you mean, and perhaps most importantly, what sort of Fourth Amendment overlay should accompany such authority.
Well, thank you for the question. The fact is the Treasury Department really does not have a lot of authority to go after purely domestic groups in the way that it goes after global terrorist organizations. It simply doesn't have that authority. You could imagine an authority that does allow for the designation of domestic organizations. It would have to take into account constitutional restrictions. When you read a lot of the court decisions, there's concerns relating to notice. Those concerns could be addressed in a statute. There's concerns that a lot of the scrutiny is heightened because sanctions are usually accompanied with asset freezes. But you could imagine sanctions that don't involve asset freezes, transaction bans that involve regulatory type of requirements that you see in Section 311 of the Patriot Act. So there's a variety of ways that both the due process standards could be raised from what we see in the global context.
They're talking about domestic sanctions against us using Patriot Act authorities. And these discussions are happening in our Congress right now about how to get around the Constitution to make this happen. And why are they trying to create a way to use sanctions against Americans? Here's Jim Himes.
Well, we all lived through a brutal event on January 6th, undertaken by right-wing extremists. No location on the political spectrum has a monopoly on extremism or violence.
January 6th. The continued exaggeration of what went down during the so-called insurrection. You know, back when George W. Bush created the War on Terror, I remember a lot of people warning that it would only be a matter of time before those tactics, then aimed at foreigners, would be used against us at home. That's the inevitable creep of authoritarianism. Well, I think that day is on our doorstep. Economic war is in the process of being aimed inward, at us. And so this episode is just part 1 of 2. I wanted you to understand what sanctions are, because in the next main episode, I'm going to read the bills, and there's actually already one that's law, that are being written by the cowards in this Congress who are treating a protest gone wild, and what is ultimately a failure of the police in DC to prepare for this particular rally as vigorously as they do for Black Lives Matter protests. By exaggerating this and calling it something on the scale of an insurrection, which it fucking wasn't. Not a single hair on a single member of Congress's head was harmed that day. The only person shot was one of the rioters, a clearly low intelligence member of our military who was told by the President of the United States, her commander-in-chief, that an election was being stolen, and who then flew across the country to try and stop it. But she brought no weapons. She just had a flag with the name of the unpatriotic idiot president that she trusted on it. That girl was a lot of things, but a terrorist is not one of them. Ashley Babbitt was one of us. She was an American citizen, and she was the only one killed that day with a weapon. All the other deaths were caused by the victim's own hardened arteries. And so for the next episode, I'm going to watch the hearings that have already taken place and share the testimony about why security failed the way that it did that day. I think that's what we really need to know, and that's what needs to be responded to. Because if Capitol Hill security had protected the building from the Trump protesters the way they routinely protect DC buildings from other, yes, darker-skinned protesters, the police did not show up that day the way they do for other protests. And if they had, we wouldn't be having any of these conversations. That event is only being branded as an insurrection because the protesters got into the building, most of them armed with non-lethal weapons like flagpoles. In real insurrections, they bring guns, all of them. And they also bring bombs and tanks. That is not what happened that day. But regardless of what answers we get about the events of January 6th, that event is being used to turn the Patriot Act against us. We're all being branded as terrorists now. And so I'm going to read the bills and the at least one law that aims to make it legal to treat us as terrorists. I want to know specifically what we might be in for, because if we citizens decide to stop feeding their nonsense about January 6th, if we stop exaggerating what happened that day, we still have a chance to intervene with our own representatives and stop the new domestic war on terror provisions from becoming law. But first, we have to know what they're thinking of doing. And so I'm going to hunt for those specifics, and I'll share what I find with you in episode 236. If you support that effort, please pay me. And if you pay at least $535 all at once or cumulatively, you can have your name listed as an executive producer on an episode or multiple episodes. But you get to choose which episode you put your name on, which serves as a public vouch for that episode, and it's a real credit. We will vouch for your financial contributions to that episode right back. You can also have your note to the community read on a main episode. And so with that, I would like to thank our anonymous executive producer for episode 108, Regime Change, which featured testimony about the Obama-Biden administration's efforts to overthrow the president of Syria back in 2015. The note from our anonymous executive producer says, quote, I would like to be the executive producer on episode 108, Regime Change Syria. Besides legal bribery in Congress, undeclared wars should be an issue we can get maximum voters' outrage about. You touched on it in this thank you episode, but administration after administration has unleashed holy hell on numerous countries without legal authorization, and Congress just keeps letting them, all the while sucking up massive bribes from the corporations who profit on war. If you can make a graphic on the revolving door between war profiteer boards of directors and high-ranking administration personnel, maybe people will see the connection. I do not have those skills, and I also don't have that information, although I wouldn't be surprised if someone out there has made those connections. But I don't personally have it, and I have absolutely no graphic design skill whatsoever. However, Hagen, who's one of our producers, if you're listening, that is something you could do that I think would be amazing to have out in the world. It's a good idea. I just don't have the skills or the time to do it, quite frankly, but it's a great idea. Back to his note, he said, all the hearings you listened to, the majority of experts, in quotation marks, Congress calls to advise them on overseas strategy are members of the war machine. How do we get the few members of Congress who may challenge this to stand up and ask why there is never anyone testifying who represents peace or who can discuss other alternatives more than bombs, unquote. Well, first of all, I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that there's never anyone testifying on the side of peace. You know, back in the George W. Bush years, one of the reasons that I became aware of what Code Pink was because the founder of Code Pink, who was a mother whose son was killed in the George W. Bush wars, she testified to Congress and was definitely on the side of these wars are stupid and should be stopped. And so that testimony does happen. But I think you are right in that the vast majority of the testimony I have seen, at least in the last, Obama, Trump, now Biden years, they are asking people who directly, personally profit from war to testify as experts, because these people can be in think tanks and it's always their think tank work that gets highlighted when they get introduced in these hearings. But all you have to do is look at their LinkedIn to find out, they're on the board of directors of James Mattis was on the board of directors of General Dynamics, which is a war industry firm. And James Mattis was our defense secretary. And so that's a very real problem that we have. And even in this episode, I think I kind of highlighted how many conflicts of interest these people that are called to testify have, and how many of them have revolving door resumes. And that is just not something that we're aware of when they get up there to testify. But the way that you get better witnesses is that you need to have better representatives on the committees, because it's essentially the people that are in charge of the committees that get to call the witnesses. And so if we have committees that are staffed with people that are trying to actually police these types of things, they're going to call witnesses with those goals. However, if, right, as we do right now, we have people that are taking money from the war industry and are corrupted by it, if those are the people that we're being represented by, if those are the people that are on the committees, if those are the people calling the witnesses, well, that's how we end up with the dumpster fire of of witness panels that we tend to see in these war-related hearings. And so basically, as with all of the issues that we have, I think the ultimate solution to that problem is we have to hire better people to represent us in Congress. And we have to find a way to get people into Congress that are not beholden to corporate masters. I think it all comes back to that. Every issue that we have comes back to that. But I agree with everything you said. I think that is a huge problem. And I think it's actually directly related to what we're talking about here, because these regime change efforts, there's wars, but sanctions are wars too. They're economic wars. And I think it's all a piece of the same puzzle. Yeah. So thank you so much for being an executive producer on that episode. And thank you to all producers of Congressional Dish. I should have the next episode, the domestic sanctions episode, out for you by the end of July. Until then, I will do another thank you episode in between. And I hope you are happy and healthy, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.